Trump and Macron display old friendship but split on the Ukraine war. President Trump declined to call President Vladimir V at a White House meeting. Putin of Russia a dictator, while President Emmanuel Macron of France stated flatly that the aggressor is Russia. President Trump and President Emmanuel Macron of France put on a show of friendship on Monday in their first meeting since last month's inauguration. But for all the clubby hugs and handshakes, they could not disguise the growing rift between the United States and Europe over the Ukraine war. During a pleasant White House meeting on the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the two leaders seemed determined to avoid an open conflict as they exchanged compliments. However, when it came to the causes of the war, each side's role in the conflict, and how it might be resolved, they diverged significantly. The United States and France were at odds at the United Nations over a resolution condemning Russia's aggression. At the time of the session, the Trump administration, along with Russia, North Korea, and Belarus, dissented from Ukraine's side, putting the United States in a position it has never, if ever, been in the United Nations history. The deepening divide was on display in capitals on both sides of the Atlantic. While the Eiffel Tower in Paris, the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, and European Union buildings in Brussels were illuminated with the blue and yellow colors of the Ukrainian flag in solidarity. The White House made no effort to demonstrate support, while many world leaders made the trek to Kyiv to stand with Ukrainian leaders. Mr. Trump focused on sealing a deal to claim the country's natural resources as recompense for military aid. "I think a lot of progress has been made," Mr. Trump said of his efforts to negotiate peace with President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia. "We've had productive discussions with Russia. We've had some very good talks with others. And we're trying to get the war ended with Russia and Ukraine." Mr. Trump also said that he might go to Moscow if a peace deal were reached, which he predicted could happen within weeks. That would make him the first American president to visit Russia in more than a decade, and would be seen as a boon for Mr. Putin, who faces an international arrest warrant for war crimes. But even as Mr. Macron called the president "Dear Donald," and repeatedly used words like friendship and shared agenda, he gently and politely struck a different note from Mr. Trump's on the war. "This peace must not mean a surrender of Ukraine," the French president said during a joint news conference in the East Room of the White House. "It must not mean a ceasefire without guarantees. Ukrainian sovereignty must be allowed by this peace." Mr. Trump made no mention of guarantees or Ukrainian sovereignty, refused to call Mr. Putin a dictator, and falsely stated that the United States had spent 3 times as much on the war as Europe had. Mr. Macron, careful not to provoke Mr. Trump, made clear that Russia was to blame for the war, not Ukraine, and corrected the president's assertions about European aid. In the Oval Office, speaking with reporters prior to their news conference, Mr. Trump did not use the term dictator without elections when he said last week that Ukraine had started the war and that Volodymyr Zelensky, the country's popularly elected president, had started the war. Putin, who has ruled as an autocrat for a quarter century. "I don't use those words lightly," Mr. Trump stated. Mr. Macron, by contrast, gave voice to the consensus view in Europe and, until now, in the United States that Moscow is to blame for the war. "This is a responsibility of Russia because the aggressor is Russia," the French president said. Mr. At one point Trump repeated the false claim that the United States had spent $350 billion to aid Ukraine and had nothing to show for it, while Europe had spent only $100 billion. In fact, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, Europe has allocated $138 billion to the war effort, compared with the $119 billion given by the United States. Mr. Trump also mischaracterized the nature of European aid. He stated, "Europe is lending the money to Ukraine. They get their money back." Mr. Macron, who earlier in the meeting had been speaking in French through an interpreter, quickly interjected in English and put his hand on Mr. the arm of Trump to correct him. "No, in fact, to be frank, we paid," Mr. Macron said. He stated that there has been a mix of grants, loans, and loan guarantees, just like in the United States. He stated, "We provided real money, to be clear." Mr. Trump, smiling, made a skeptical face and waved his hand, as if to say that he did not buy it. As he had promised on the campaign trail, Trump would broker an end to the war within 24 hours or before his inauguration. He claimed that talks he had started with Within weeks, if we're smart, Putin says, the war could be over. He added, if we're not smart, it will keep going and we will lose young, beautiful people. The president emphasized his demand that Ukraine sign over hundreds of billions of dollars in mineral rights to repay U.S. military aid, which Mr. Zelensky has resisted. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, however, said U.S. and Ukrainian negotiators were very close to a deal, at the 1-yard line, and Mr. Trump said that Mr. Zelensky could come to Washington to sign it as soon as this week or the next. Mr. Trump's return to power is convulsing relations with European allies, as he threatens to impose tariffs on their consumer goods, demands that they increase military spending even beyond a previous target, and breaks with them over Ukraine. A speech Vice President J.D. Vance gave in Munich suggested that European nations' own political and cultural policies, not Russia or China, pose the greatest security threat. In an effort to devise a strategy for dealing with an America that appears to be favoring Russia over its traditional allies, Macron has convened 2 meetings of European leaders, but he then rushed to Washington for a hurriedly organized meeting with Mr. Trump to fortify the president in negotiations over the fate of Ukraine. His visit is part of a blitz of European trips to Washington these days. To influence the new administration, President Andrzej Duda of Poland attended the Conservative Political Action Conference outside Washington over the weekend to meet with Mr. Trump, who kept him waiting for more than an hour. Additionally, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer intends to pay a visit to the White House on Thursday. Mr. and Trump Macron have a long and complicated history. As the president greeted Mr. Macron and Trump engaged in a vigorous handshake on Monday at the West Wing's entrance, evoking similar encounters during Mr. Trump's first term. During their later session in the Oval Office, they flashed smiles, flattered each other and jocularly shook hands again. At the end of their subsequent news conference, Mr. Macron made it a priority to give Mr. Trump, after the massacre of Ukrainian civilians in Bucha in 2022. Macron stated that he had cut off his own contacts with the Russian president, and warned last week that you can't be weak in front of President Putin. However, he quickly added that he supported Mr. Trump's new effort because his election presented a new context. He also emphasized that any agreement with Russia must be checked and verified, citing the 2 ceasefires known as the Minsk Accords, which were signed but later disregarded following Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014. In response, Trump stated that Russia would benefit from making a deal, but he did not specify what Moscow would have to give up, or what security guarantees would need to be negotiated. Says, I truly believe that he wants to make a deal. Trump said of Mr. Putin, may be wrong, but I believe he wants to make a deal. He added that he had spoken with Mr. Putin about the possibility of deploying European peacekeepers to Ukraine to monitor any ceasefire, and that the Russian president would go along with it. Mr. Macron, one of the prime sponsors of the idea of a European peacekeeping force, said he agreed with Mr. Trump asserts that Europe needs to shoulder more responsibility. As for the United States, he added that the Americans will be there in solidarity. Whether Mr. Putin really would accept foreign troops on Ukrainian territory could be an important factor in any negotiations. In an interview released on Monday, Mr. Putin stressed the economic benefits of a rapprochement with the United States, playing to Mr. Trump's interest in international diplomacy's financial aspects. As for Mr. Trump, the Russian leader praised him, calling him someone who does not simply say what he thinks, but he says what he wants.